Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into the Trump administration's really extensive use of tariffs.
Yeah, it's quite a story.
We've looked at a pretty comprehensive analysis here. Covers how they were implemented, the thinking behind them, and the global economic impact.
Right.
So our mission really is to just pull out the key takeaways for you, make sense of this complex policy without, getting lost in the weeds.
And what's striking really is the sheer number of tools they used. It wasn't just one simple tariff approach.
Okay, like what?
Well, first off, you've got Section 232. Now, that's typically for genuine national security threats.
Right.
But it was used here for global tariffs on steel, 25%, and aluminum, which was 10%.
And the justification was national security for steel and aluminum.
The argument was that, relying too heavily on imports weakened domestic production, which they said was vital for defense. They even looked at cars and parts under that same logic.
Okay, let's pause on that national security angle. It seems like they defined it pretty broadly, maybe beyond just military needs.
Exactly. The analysis suggests a link was drawn between having a strong industrial base at home and being able to meet security needs in a crisis.
Sort of, if you can't make your own steel.
How do you defend yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah, basically. It allowed for a much wider use of Section 232 than perhaps seen before.
Interesting. And what else was in the toolkit?
Then there's Section 301. That became the main weapon against China.
Okay.
This was focused on what the administration called unfair trade practices. Things like IP theft, copying patents, and forced technology transfer.
Where companies basically had to hand over tech secrets to get market access.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that led to tariffs on, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. It was huge.
Wow. And you mentioned others, too. There was IEPA.
Yeah, IEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Sounds dramatic, right?
It really does. How did that fit in?
Well, it's usually for, actual international crises.
Mm-hmm.
But they first used it kind of creatively against Mexico and Canada over immigration and drug issues. But then, maybe even more unexpectedly, they used it to declare the entire U.S. trade deficit a national emergency.
The deficit itself, an emergency.
And that action, theoretically, opened the door to maybe a baseline 10% global tariff plus potentially higher reciprocal ones. It was a significant expansion of that law's scope.
So pulling back a bit, what were the main reasons given for all these different tariffs?
The analysis points to a few core motivations. A big one was definitely reducing trade deficits and pushing for what they called reciprocity.
That idea that trade wasn't fair and tariffs would level the playing field.
Exactly. Like if they charge us high tariffs, we should charge them high tariffs.
Yeah.
Then bolstering national security, like we talked about, protecting those key domestic industries, also protecting American manufacturing jobs, trying to shield them from foreign competition and, encourage production back home.
And countering China, obviously.
Oh, definitely. Countering China's perceived unfair practices, especially around tech and IP, was a major driver.
It's interesting, though, the analysis mentions the trade deficit didn't actually shrink much. Why not, do we think?
Yeah, that's a key finding. It seems global supply chains are just so tangled. Businesses often found other countries to buy from, or they just absorbed the costs.
And people kept buying stuff.
Right. Consumer demand stayed pretty solid. It just shows, trade deficits are complicated. Tariffs alone don't seem to be a magic bullet.
What about the effects elsewhere? The analysis mentioned the Philippines.
Yeah, specifics were a bit thin in the source material for the Philippines, but given their role in global supply chains, they probably felt indirect effects. Shifts in U.S.-China trade, general disruption.
Right, and potentially those hypothetical reciprocal tariffs, if they'd happen more broadly.
Could have been, yes.
Yeah.
But it's hard to say definitively from the analysis we have.
And the big partners, China, EU, Canada, Mexico.
Oh, they were hit hard. China obviously faced huge tariffs and retaliated, which really hurt U.S. farmers, for example.
Yeah, I remember the soybean stories.
Exactly. And because supply chains, especially in North America with Canada and Mexico, are so integrated, those tariffs caused a lot of disruption, particularly in the auto sector. The EU also faced tariffs and retaliated.
So a lot of back and forth.
Definitely. It really shows how connected everything is. Actions in one place cause reactions elsewhere, fast.
So turning back to the U.S. then, who ultimately paid the price for these tariffs?
Well, the analysis suggests it was largely U.S. consumers. Prices went up on a lot of goods.
So much for saving money.
Right. And while some protected industries, like steel, maybe saw small job gains, The studies suggest the cost per job created was extremely high.
And what about other businesses?
Industries using imported components got squeezed, and exporters facing that retaliation we talked about, they suffered too. Overall, the net effect on U.S. GDP was likely, well, negative.
So looking at the global picture, what were the broader consequences?
You saw definite shifts in trade patterns, like the U.S. started importing more from Vietnam and Mexico, possibly bypassing China tariffs. There was also just more economic uncertainty worldwide, and relationships with allies definitely strained.
And the trading system itself, like the WTO.
Yeah, the World Trade Organization faced challenges. Using unilateral actions, and especially broadening that national security argument so much, it potentially weakened the established international trade rules.
Okay, so if you had to boil it down, what's the key takeaway here?
I think it's that the Trump administration's tariff strategy was a really significant shift. It leaned heavily on unilateral action to chase goals, like reducing the deficit and boosting national security. But the evidence we reviewed suggests limited success in actually achieving those specific goals. And it came with pretty substantial costs for U.S. consumers and businesses, plus major disruptions globally.
Right. So it leaves us with a pretty big question, doesn't it?
It does.
This whole expansive use of national security, even national emergencies, to justify tariffs. It makes you wonder, how should countries balance their own domestic economic worries against these established international trade rules?
Especially when there's a real risk of things escalating into, tit-for-tat protectionism.
Yeah. What does it all tell us about just how complicated global trade is now? Something to think about. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.